The last time anyone saw Emily Hart was on a cold September night. A night when the rain was coming down so hard that even the streets, always so familiar to her, felt like strangers. She was supposed to meet her girlfriend, Sarah. A quiet night in, she had told her friends earlier. Maybe a movie. Maybe dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to make anyone worry. But by sunrise, Emily was gone. Her car was still parked outside Sarah's house. Her phone, left on the nightstand, as if she had never intended to go far. And her beloved dog, always by her side, was locked inside her apartment, hungry and alone. Hours turned to days. And as the search for Emily stretched on, people began to whisper. Friends, family, neighbors, each with their own version of what might have happened. And when her diary was found, tucked deep inside her dresser drawer, what lay within those pages would leave detectives, and everyone who loved her, shaken to the core. Emily had been writing about her relationship. About the woman she trusted. About the one person who was supposed to protect her. Yet, in those pages, there were words filled with fear. Words that described nights filled with silence, glances she couldn't understand, and moments that left her questioning everything. Police thought they were investigating a disappearance. But what they uncovered was far worse. And as they followed the evidence, piece by piece, a story began to emerge, one of obsession, jealousy, and betrayal. A story that would tear apart lives and leave a family searching for answers they might never fully receive. Tonight, we are going to tell you Emily's story. From the beginning, when love felt like salvation, to the end, when it became a cage she could no longer escape. You will hear from the people who knew her best, the investigators who fought to uncover the truth, and the small clues that ultimately unraveled everything. Every message. Every lie. Every desperate cry for help buried beneath a smile. Stay with us as we walk through every moment, through a relationship that began in quiet whispers and ended in a storm no one saw coming. This is the story of a love affair that didn't just end in heartbreak, but in death. To understand how everything led to that night, how a love story could end in the ultimate betrayal, we have to go back to where it all began. A small town tucked quietly in the Pacific Northwest. A place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were still left unlocked, and where people rarely spoke of the things they didn't want to see. Emily Hart was 27 years old. By all accounts, she was kind, soft-spoken, and loved by her students. A woman who carried a sketchbook everywhere she went, filling its pages with drawings of people she passed on the street, birds perched on telephone wires, and wildflowers that grew in the empty lots behind the school where she taught art. Her friends described her as gentle, warm. Someone who would drop everything to help, who believed the best in people, even when she shouldn't have. A woman who smiled with her eyes but often looked away when she was thinking too hard. She had moved to town 3 years earlier, hoping for a fresh start after a breakup that left her heartbroken. Hoping, perhaps, that small-town life could offer the peace she had long been searching for. And for a time, it seemed as though she had found it. That was when she met Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was different from anyone Emily had dated before. Bold, funny, sharp-witted. Someone who lit up a room just by walking in. A woman who could make strangers laugh in an instant, but who, as people would later say, didn't let many get too close. The two met at a community fundraiser, an art auction to raise money for the local library. They spent the evening talking in hushed voices in a corner, ignoring the crowd around them, as though they were the only two people in the room. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Emily's friends watched as she seemed happier, more alive. The sketchbook that once filled with soft, quiet drawings began to fill with bold strokes, intense colors. She smiled more. She talked about the future. About the trips she wanted to take, the places she wanted to show Sarah. But as with many stories like this, when something seems too perfect, there are often cracks that only those closest to them start to see. At first, it was small things. Emily stopped answering texts as quickly. She canceled plans more often. When her friends asked, she would laugh it off, saying she was just busy, that she was happy. But there were moments when her voice faltered. When she seemed distracted, glancing at her phone too much. And then there was the night she showed up to dinner with a bruise on her wrist she couldn't explain. "I tripped," she said. "I'm so clumsy." But her friends remembered how she avoided their eyes when she said it. How her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her fork. Sarah, for her part, had her own reputation. While charming to those who didn't know her well, there were stories. Whispers about how things had ended with her last girlfriend. Stories of jealousy, of fights that got too heated, of words that cut deeper than anyone realized. No one ever had proof. Just stories passed quietly from one person to the next. Stories that would later seem too close to the truth to ignore. Still, Emily stayed. She loved Sarah, she told herself. And maybe she believed that was enough. Maybe she thought love could fix whatever was broken. But then came the fight. It was a Sunday night, 3 weeks before Emily disappeared. Neighbors would later say they heard shouting from Sarah's house, loud enough to echo into the street. One neighbor said she heard something slam against the wall. But when asked, Sarah would claim they were just arguing, like any couple. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth worrying about. But to Emily's friends, something had changed. She became quieter, distant. And then there was the letter. Weeks later, when police searched Emily's apartment, they found it. Torn in half, stuffed deep into the trash where she must have hoped no one would ever find it. But the pieces fit together, and when they read her words, there was no denying what was happening. "I don't know how to leave," she wrote. "I don't know if she'll let me." Police would learn that Emily had confided in at least one friend. That she had talked about wanting to leave, about being afraid of what Sarah might do if she tried. But no one, not even Emily, could have imagined how far it would go. And then, on September 12, Emily vanished. She had left her apartment earlier that evening, texting her friend that she was going over to Sarah's house to talk. She never said what the conversation was about. But what we know now is that she never left that house alive. What happened between the moment Emily walked through that door and the moment Sarah called the police to report her missing would become the focus of one of the most shocking investigations this town had ever seen. An investigation that would reveal secrets, lies, and the cold, hard truth about what happens when love turns into possession. And yet, even with all the evidence, even with all the rumors, there would be questions left unanswered. Because the most haunting part of this case isn't just how Emily died, it's what may have been missed along the way. The signs people ignored. The cries for help that went unanswered. In the first 24 hours after Emily Hart was reported missing, investigators did what they always do when someone vanishes without a trace. They started with the people closest to her. The people she would have seen last. The people who might have known if she had a reason to run, or a reason to fear for her life. On paper, Sarah Mitchell was cooperative. She opened her door when detectives arrived. She answered their questions without hesitation, at least at first. She told them that Emily had come over the night before, yes. But she claimed they had argued, about what, she was vague, and that Emily had stormed out sometime after midnight, refusing a ride home. According to Sarah, Emily had walked away, alone, into the darkness, refusing to answer her calls or texts after that. But police noticed something almost immediately. There was no sign of Emily's coat. No bag. No purse. No house keys. Nothing that would suggest she had planned to leave for good, or even for long. And there, parked along the curb, was Emily's car, locked, silent, waiting, as though she had never intended to go anywhere without it. Sarah told police she didn't know what happened next. She looked tired, but calm. But when detectives asked if they could take a look inside her house, her answer was quick and firm, I'd rather you didn't. And that was when the first real question took root in the minds of those investigators. If Emily was truly missing, why wouldn't Sarah let them see where she was last seen alive? The next day, as police waited on a warrant, they started speaking to people in Emily's life. Friends. Family. Co-workers. The people who might understand why a woman like Emily would suddenly vanish. And what they heard painted a picture far different from the one Sarah had offered. Friends spoke of a relationship that had shifted over the past 6 months. They said Emily had seemed distracted at work, showing up late, leaving early. One friend, who had known Emily for over a decade, said she had never seen her pull away from people the way she had in those final weeks. Text messages between Emily and her closest confidant, a woman named Rachel, were shared with police. In those texts, Emily had expressed growing unease about Sarah's temper. How small arguments would turn into hours of cold silence. How Sarah would monitor who Emily spoke to, asking pointed questions when she came home late, checking her phone when she thought Emily wasn't looking. One message stood out, written just 4 days before Emily disappeared: "I'm scared. If I leave, I don't know what she'll do." By day 3, police obtained the warrant they needed to search Sarah's home. And what they found raised alarms. Though the house was clean, too clean, some would say, there were signs that something wasn't right. In the bathroom, a rug was missing. Gone. No explanation. In the living room, where Sarah claimed they had argued, detectives found what looked like small drops of something dark on the edge of the hardwood floor, barely visible to the naked eye. Later testing would confirm it: blood. Traces of Emily's DNA. But even as investigators gathered evidence, Sarah clung to her story. She said Emily must have hurt herself and left. She insisted she had tried to call her, that she was worried too. Yet when police checked her phone records, they found something that contradicted that story. There were no outgoing calls or texts to Emily after she supposedly stormed out. Nothing at all from Sarah's phone until almost noon the next day, when she called Emily's mother to say she was missing. It was as if Sarah had gone to bed and slept soundly while Emily, according to her, was wandering the streets alone in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. They spoke to neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Emily leave the house. And that was when they found their first real witness. An elderly man, living across the street, said he had been up late that night, unable to sleep. He told police he saw Emily arrive around 9 p.m. He remembered because she had waved at him as she walked toward the house. But when asked if he had seen her leave, his answer was short and chilling: "No. I never saw her leave. I was watching." This man's statement would grow in importance as the investigation went on. Because if Emily had never left that house, then something had happened to her inside it. And then, on day 5, came the most damning piece of evidence so far. Police retrieved surveillance footage from a gas station 2 blocks from Sarah's house. Footage that showed Sarah at 2:17 a.m., hours after Emily was supposedly gone, buying cleaning supplies. Bleach. Garbage bags. A mop. Paper towels. And when officers asked her about it, Sarah's answer was painfully thin: "I spilled something. I needed to clean it up." But police already knew what she was trying to clean. Lab results from the floor samples had come back. And they confirmed what detectives feared: Emily's blood. Enough of it to suggest that something violent had taken place. Still, Sarah refused to confess. She refused to admit that Emily was dead. She insisted she had no idea where Emily was, and that she had nothing to hide. But with the evidence mounting, the walls were closing in. And soon, another discovery would take the investigation to a whole new level. Because what detectives found next, hidden in the back of Sarah's car, would remove all doubt about what had happened that night. By the end of that first week, the town that had once whispered quietly about Emily's disappearance was now speaking out loud, with fear, suspicion, and growing anger. Her family had set up a vigil near the town square, candles flickering under photos of her smiling face. Flyers covered bulletin boards and telephone poles. The community was waking up to the realization that Emily wasn't coming home. And they wanted answers. Inside the police station, detectives were working around the clock. Reviewing statements. Following up on tips. Searching for the one thing they still didn't have, Emily's body. And as long as there was no body, there would always be the slim chance that Sarah could escape the worst of the charges. But all that changed on a rainy Friday afternoon, when a team of officers, armed with a second search warrant, returned to Sarah's property. The car was still there. A dark gray sedan, parked neatly along the side of the house. From the outside, it looked ordinary. But when investigators pried open the trunk, what they found would alter the course of the entire investigation. Hidden beneath a layer of blankets and towels, wrapped tightly as though someone had tried to contain every trace, was a set of blood-stained clothing. A t-shirt, torn near the collar. Jeans soaked through in patches of dried blood. The forensic team would later confirm what the detectives already feared: it was Emily's blood. So much of it that, as one officer would later say, you don't walk away from that much blood loss. But there was more. Underneath the clothing, tucked into the spare tire well, was a small jewelry box. And inside that box was a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with Emily's initials. A bracelet her mother later confirmed she wore every day. She would never have left it behind. With that discovery, the investigation moved from a missing persons case to a homicide. And Sarah Mitchell went from person of interest to prime suspect. When police brought her back in for questioning, her demeanor had changed. Gone was the calm, helpful partner she had tried to portray. She was cold. Short. Her answers clipped and defensive. She denied knowing anything about the clothing or the bracelet. She said anyone could have put it there. But detectives weren't buying it. And neither was the public. Word of the discovery spread fast, and by the next morning, headlines filled every local paper: breakthrough in Emily Hart case, blood evidence found. But the most critical moment in this case came 2 days later, when detectives sat Sarah down for one last interview, a moment that would later be played to a stunned courtroom, and that Emily's family would never forget. Sarah began the interview silent, arms crossed, staring at the table. Detectives pressed her, calm at first, then firmer. They laid out every piece of evidence. The blood in the house. The surveillance video from the gas station. The clothes in her car. And then, the final blow, DNA results proving the blood was Emily's. Still, she didn't speak. She sat there, unmoving, as if none of it could touch her. Until the lead detective slid a photo across the table. A picture of Emily and Sarah together. Taken just weeks before. Both smiling. Both holding hands at a park. And that was when something shifted. Sarah's eyes stayed locked on the photo. Her jaw clenched. Her hands, still folded tightly, began to tremble. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a long breath, sharp and shaky. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thin, almost as if she were speaking to herself. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said. She wouldn't listen. Detectives leaned in, asking her what she meant. Sarah looked up, her eyes red now, and said something that would haunt everyone in that room. She said she was leaving me. She said she was done. After everything, after all I gave her. She wasn't going to leave me behind. But when they asked what she had done to Emily, where Emily's body was, Sarah's walls went back up. She shook her head, eyes cold again, and said only, "You'll never find her." Those 4 words were enough to seal her fate. Enough for prosecutors to move forward. But for Emily's family, for her friends, they weren't enough. They needed to bring her home. As investigators searched nearby woods, lakes, and ravines, hoping to find the final answer, a picture of the last night of Emily's life began to take shape. Based on phone records, diary entries, and what Sarah had finally admitted, detectives pieced together that Emily had gone to Sarah's house to end the relationship. She had told a friend earlier that day she was afraid of what might happen but felt she had to do it in person. At some point that night, something set Sarah off. Maybe Emily finally said the words Sarah couldn't bear to hear. Maybe there was a fight. What they do know is that Emily never made it out alive. Evidence of a violent struggle was later confirmed by blood spatter patterns found beneath the floorboards of Sarah's living room. A spot Sarah had tried to clean but hadn't quite erased. They found traces on the walls, faint but there. Enough for a forensic team to reconstruct the horror of what happened there. The murder itself, though brutal, was only part of the story. What shook the community to its core was the realization that Emily had been reaching out for help in the weeks leading up to her death. Quiet cries, text messages to friends, lines in her journal, even a conversation with a coworker where she had said, "I think I'm in trouble." All signs that were seen too late. Sarah Mitchell was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction. But even as she sat in jail, awaiting trial, she never revealed where Emily's body was. And that is the haunting truth that lingers to this day. As the trial drew near, the town that had once watched Emily walk to school with her sketchbook now waited for justice. The courtroom would soon hear every detail, the blood evidence, the confession, the witnesses. But would that be enough to bring closure to a family who still didn't know where their daughter was? The trial of Sarah Mitchell began on a gray Monday morning, nearly 1 year after Emily Hart disappeared. The courthouse steps, usually empty and quiet, were packed with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had never met Emily but who felt drawn to her story. Some held candles. Some clutched photos of Emily, photos that showed her smiling, alive, unaware of the storm that would one day take her life. Inside, Emily's family sat in the front row of the courtroom, her mother gripping a small locket that had belonged to Emily as a child. A locket she hadn't taken off since the night her daughter went missing. Eyes scanned the room for a moment, she never once looked toward Emily's family. The prosecution opened with a simple but powerful statement: "This is a case of obsession and control that led to murder." Over the days that followed, the jury listened to hours of testimony. Experts spoke of the forensic evidence, the blood found in Sarah's house, the clothing hidden in her trunk, the bracelet tucked away as though it had never meant anything. They showed photos to the courtroom, images of blood traces too painful for Emily's mother to look at. Each photo was a reminder that Emily hadn't simply vanished. She had been taken violently, and her body still lay somewhere unknown. But the most powerful moments came when those who knew Emily took the stand. Her best friend, Rachel, was the first to testify. She spoke softly at first, her hands trembling as she unfolded a piece of paper where she had written the words she didn't trust herself to remember. She read texts Emily had sent in the weeks before she died, texts where Emily had written, "I don't know how to get out. I think she'll hurt me if I leave." And then Rachel paused, looking up through tears, and said, "Emily was scared. She was reaching out, and none of us knew how bad it really was. I should have done more. I should have been there." The courtroom was silent as she cried, her voice breaking on the last words, "I just want my friend back." Next, Emily's mother took the stand. Her voice was stronger than anyone expected. Years of grief had forged something steady in her, a need for truth, for her daughter's story to be heard in full. "Emily was my only child," she said, her voice thick but unwavering. "She was kind. She was trusting. She loved with her whole heart. And I have to live every day knowing that someone took advantage of that love. That someone who claimed to care for her took her away from us." She turned, then, and looked directly at Sarah. "You took her from me. You took everything." There were people in that courtroom who would later say they had never heard anything more powerful than the way a mother spoke to the woman accused of killing her child. The defense, for their part, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Sarah and Emily had a complicated relationship. That Emily had been troubled, confused, and perhaps had left town on her own. They suggested that without a body, there was still room for doubt. But with every piece of evidence laid bare, every blood sample, every message, every contradiction in Sarah's story, their arguments began to crumble. Then came the final piece, Sarah's own words, captured during her police interview. The jury listened as Sarah's voice echoed through the courtroom, her breaking, halting confession, and those chilling final words, "You'll never find her." When the closing arguments ended, the courtroom held its breath. Emily's family sat holding hands, waiting for the decision that would shape the rest of their lives. And after 2 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the room, their faces somber. The judge asked for the verdict. And with a voice that carried across the room, the foreperson said, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Mitchell, guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emily's mother wept quietly. Rachel, sitting behind her, reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. In the corner, a reporter wiped away tears of her own, as though even those who had come to simply cover the story could not help but be moved by the weight of that moment. Sarah showed no reaction. She stood, her face blank, as though hearing the words but refusing to let them sink in. The judge ordered her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And just like that, she was led away, never to see the outside world again. Yet even as justice was served, there was a silence that lingered. Because Emily was still missing. And her family, though grateful for the verdict, had to return home without her. In the months that followed, search efforts continued. Volunteers combed through the woods, walked the banks of nearby rivers, and dug through abandoned buildings, hoping for some trace. Hoping that Sarah might one day speak the truth about where Emily was. But as of today, that answer has never come. Emily's story became more than a tragedy. It became a call to action. Her mother began speaking out, raising awareness about domestic violence, especially in relationships people don't always recognize as dangerous. She went to schools, community centers, and courtrooms, telling Emily's story so that others might see the signs Emily's friends and family missed. She started a foundation in her daughter's name, one that offers support and resources to women, especially in LGBTQ+ relationships, where fear and isolation can be even harder to speak about. Through her grief, she built something that might save others. But every year on September 12th, she still holds a candlelight vigil in Emily's memory. Hoping that somewhere, someone will come forward with the final piece of truth. As the years pass, Emily's smile lives on in photos. Her artwork still hangs in the school where she taught, and her story continues to be told, not as a headline, but as a reminder. A reminder of what happens when love turns to control. When fear replaces trust. And when the cries for help are heard too late. As we close this story, we remember Emily Hart. A woman who loved deeply. Who saw beauty in small things. And who deserved so much more than the fate she was given. And to anyone listening, if you or someone you know is in a relationship that feels dangerous, if there are signs of control, manipulation, or fear, reach out. There is help. There are people who will listen. Emily's story should never be anyone else's. Thank you for staying with us. For honoring Emily's story. And for remembering her name. Emily's story is one that should never have happened. And as we close her chapter tonight, we want to leave you with a few questions to carry with you, because this conversation doesn't end here. Do you believe justice was fully served? Do you think Sarah Mitchell acted alone? Or is there more to this story that has yet to be revealed? And what do you believe happened to Emily's body? We know so many of you have thoughts, insights, and questions of your own. And we want to hear them. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, your theories, your reactions, and your voice matter. Because when we talk about these cases, when we refuse to let them fade away, we honor the victims and bring light to the truths that others want hidden. If you want to see more real stories like Emily's, if you want to help give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. Every case we cover is handled with care, and we will continue to share the stories that deserve to be heard. Please also take a moment to like this video, not for us, but to help Emily's story reach more people. You never know who might see it and find strength or understanding in these words. And finally, if you or someone you love is experiencing fear or control in a relationship, whether it's loud or quiet, whether people see it or don't, there are people who care. Please reach out. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Thank you for remembering Emily.